Now I would love to introduce you to one of our international guest speakers, Professor Roger Barker, who spoke at the 2015 conference in Adelaide and is now celebrating his 10-year anniversary with us. And he's going to present on how we are trying to solve Parkinson's from cause to cure. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much for inviting me back. It only seemed like yesterday, but it was 10 years ago. So in this talk, I'm going to sort of pick up on something that George was talking about, which is around epidemiology, so incidence and prevalence, but I'm going to talk about it in a slightly different way, which is the concept that whilst we conceive of Parkinson's disease as one disorder, it is actually more complicated than that. And so I think starting to understand with some of the new tools that we have the different types of Parkinson's disease is going to impact on how we think about clinical trials. They'll be much more targeted in the future so that certain people will be suitable for other trials over different ones. Then I'm going to talk a little bit about the trial landscape, and you might be surprised to know just how many trials are going on in Parkinson's at the moment. And then I'm going to talk through some examples of how we've tried to use information about what goes wrong in Parkinson's to inform us about trials, how trials have developed, and then I'm going to finish up with a sort of new area, which are these platform trials to try and rapidly move therapies into clinic, assess them, and we can either abandon them or move on to the next one. So that's the sort of structure of the talk, and as I say, I'm going to start by trying to explain a little bit about natural history and heterogeneity. So George has given a very good introduction on some of the limitations of our knowledge of Parkinson's. And so when I began working in this area over 25 years ago, what I was very interested in, and I'll talk more about this tomorrow, was taking dopamine cell therapies into people with Parkinson's. But I realized that I didn't actually know who would be the optimal people for this. And I didn't also know very much about what happens about Parkinson's or what we know about Parkinson's in the community. So we set about a study, which we set up now 25 years ago, called the campaign study. So this was an attempt, as George has said, there were no incident studies. So we were trying to work out what does Parkinson's look like in the real world. So this was a project which collected everybody who could conceivably have Parkinson's in the county of Cambridgeshire in the east of England. So that's 1 million people. So in the UK, we did this through the GPs. So we wrote to all the GPs and said, just send us anybody who you think could conceivably have Parkinson's. So over the course of 2 years, we had 260 people sent to us, of which 160 we thought had Parkinson's, 100 didn't, but we were very broad. So some people had a frozen shoulder, some people had a bit of muscle aching, some people had tremors for other reasons. And essentially we have followed this population over the next 25 years. So this has given us some very useful information about Parkinson's, which didn't exist before we did this study. And so these basic facts, I think, are quite surprising. Well, they were surprising to me. So in Cambridgeshire, a population of 1 million, every week there's a new case diagnosed, so every 5 days. So by the time I'm back in England on Friday, there'll be a new case diagnosed somewhere in the county of Cambridgeshire. The average age you get Parkinson's is 70. In America, they say the average age is 59. That is the average age in America that you can get any healthcare for your Parkinson's, which is not the same as Parkinson's in the normal population. So that's the age you get it, and it doesn't shorten your life. So when we looked at death in this population through death certificates, only 1 in 10 of the death certificates actually showed that the person died with Parkinson's disease. Only, I think, about 30% had it on, but the average life expectancy of people with Parkinson's disease was exactly the same in the county as those who didn't have it. It obviously has morbidity, so it does affect quality of life. And as you know, it is associated with a risk of dementia. So 10 years into the illness, about 40% of people have a dementia. And based on some work done in Sydney many years ago, at 20 years, that increases to about 80%. In order to make sure that this wasn't just a quirk of what we did back at those days, we did another study which reproduced what we'd done earlier on. So this is the sort of basic foundation. This is what Parkinson's looks like in the real world. So having collected that information, we were then interested to know, well, what happens to people over time? So we had no hypothesis. We weren't sure what would happen. We just assumed some people were going to do well and some were going to do less well. So we followed people over time, and this essentially allowed us to make a few conclusions. First of all, there were different types of thinking problems in Parkinson's, which I'm not going to talk about, but I've already mentioned around the dementia. We also started to notice that there were changes in how patients behaved based on inflammation in the blood when they first came to see us. So this is an inflammation as they progress. It's when they first pitch up. And we also found some interesting data, or recently MARTA, around the degree of constipation when people present and their clinical progression. And that led us to sort of postulate that there are two types of Parkinson's, or at least they sit on a spectrum. So there is a group of younger patients, so these are people typically in their 50s and early 60s. They may have some subtle thinking deficits, but essentially they do rather well. So they progress rather slowly. They don't tend to get much in the way of major thinking problems. They don't tend to develop falls. And interestingly, when we looked at the data, these patients were taking drugs to suppress inflammation, such as aspirin, Brufen and drugs like that, not for their Parkinson's, but for other conditions. So I don't know whether that was important or not, but it certainly implied there may be some link there, and I'll come back to that. In contrast, we found that people who were over the age of 72 when they presented tended to have some problems with thinking. And in particular, there were two thinking tests which we thought were heavily associated with developing, sadly, major thinking problems. One was the ability to come up with a list of animals. So we had a test of you had to name as many animals in 90 seconds as you could. If you had less than 20, that was a bad sign. And we also had a task where you had to have a pentagon, and then you had to draw another pentagon, and they interlocked, and you had to copy it. And people who had difficulty with that were very likely to run into major thinking problems early on. This group of people also had more inflammation in their blood when we looked at it, and were more constipated. So simplistically, we would say there's a relatively benign form of Parkinson's, and there is a more aggressive form of Parkinson's, which are characterized at presentation in this way. So we now have the ability when people present to say, how are you going to do in the next few years? So that has immediate prognostic value when you come to clinic, but it also raises some interesting scientific questions. The question is, why do one group do better than the other, or one worse than the other if you turn it around like that? So we tried to look at some of the genetic factors which were associated with this. So these are variations in certain genes which seem to influence which group you fall into, independent of your age. So this would imply that these genes, the first one up there is Alpha-Synuclein, which is the gene which codes for the protein which lies at the heart of Parkinson's, is in some way important with the speed with which you progress through this condition. I'm not going to go through all the rest of them, but essentially this has now laid the foundation for big international efforts to try and find which genetic variants lead to the progression of the disease more rapidly. This has instant therapeutic implications, because if we are going to use disease-modifying therapy, which I will come on to talk about shortly, then if we take the group on your left, which are the benign group, they're going to do relatively well, whatever we do. If we look at the other group, they are more likely to be the group where we will see an effect of disease modification more easily. The challenge there is that they have more aggressive disease. So this is no different to what people have been doing for decades with cancer. People have benign tumours and more aggressive tumours. And as you will know, in the world of cancer, your therapies are very much determined by what they think that cancer looks like, not whether it's breast cancer, but benign or more malignant. And this, I think, is how we're going to have to start thinking about Parkinson's, as to what it is, what type of Parkinson's do people have, what does that mean for the future, and then more importantly, what underlies that so we can target it with our disease-modifying therapies. But if we're to get at what's driving this disease, how can we do that? I've shown you one way of doing that, which is to collect large groups of people and see which genes seem to be pushing you in from a benign to a more aggressive disease, and then try and target your therapy against those genes. So in this case, you could imagine trying to target alpha-synuclein. Of late has been a sort of revolution in techniques that we can now use in the laboratory to start to understand people's Parkinson's disease in the dish. So one particular strategy that we've used is where we take skin cells from patients with Parkinson's, and then we take those skin cells, we grow them up, they're the fibroblasts, and then we directly convert those cells into the cells of Parkinson's or are lost in Parkinson's. So this direct conversion of skin cells into dopamine cells is designed so we can look at dopamine cells in the dish from individual patients, which retains age, because a lot of the technologies, if you reprogram cells, many of you may have heard of these induced pluripotent stem cells, they might be useful for cell therapies, and I'll talk about that tomorrow, but for modelling disease it has a problem, because when you reprogram them back to iPS cells, you put them back to day zero, so you lose all of age, and as George said, age is the biggest risk factor for Parkinson's. So using this technique, we've been able to work out how we can do this, and we can make nerve cells from patients with this condition. This then enables us to actually look at large numbers of patients to see what the problems are. So in this study, we took 18 people with Parkinson's, 10 people without. We took skin from these patients, we grew up the cells from them, we turned them into nerve cells, and then we studied what was wrong, and we found that there was a problem in these nerve cells, you can't really read it because it's off the bottom of the slide, of them getting rid of the protein. So this tended to imply that in this group of patients that we'd selected from our natural history study, the problem in these patients was that the rubbish collectors were coming infrequently, so rubbish was accumulating. So the strategy for this group of patients would be to have a drug which gets the dustbin men to turn up more frequently through this process of autophagy. Might not work for everybody, but it would work for this group of patients. So this has dramatically changed our understanding of what people look like at the biological level, which will inform our therapies. The other revolution which has happened in the last 10 years is to do with brains that are donated for research. So in years gone by, one used to be able to stain these brains, and we can still do that. And in fact, the diagnosis of Parkinson's disease in 2025 is still done on post-mortem material. So the only way you know that someone definitely has Parkinson's is when they're dead, which isn't particularly helpful, but that is how it is. But what we have actually now got is we have this capacity to take the dead human brain and examine every single cell in that brain to see what it was doing before you died. So this is a section of brain from a patient who kindly donated their brain for research, and every single one of these pixels is a brain cell, and the colour of that brain cell reflects these genes which are around inflammation. So you now not only can study cells in the dish from patients with Parkinson's disease, but in those who've sadly passed away with it, you can start to understand what's happening in every cell, every different type of cell, in every part of the brain when they died. And you start to find things which you were not expecting. So this bit of area of the brain, which is where dopamine normally is lost, is very inflamed. We chose this bit of brain to study because I thought it had no inflammation in, and it was my control area of brain, but it shows that it's not behaving as we think. This not only gives us new insights and throws up surprises, but it also gives us clues about therapeutics, because if that bit of the brain's inflamed, I've already talked about anti-inflammatory drugs, inflammation in Parkinson's disease is clearly something we need to consider. So this natural history data has enabled us to, I see they've given me the wrong set of slides. I changed them, never mind. What this information can do is we can now use this to start to build pathways. So having all of this information from these studies in the community, collecting all this information from cells we grow in the dish, we can now start to build a model of Parkinson's which enables us to start to understand it. So this is a very simplistic view of what we think goes wrong. We think people with Parkinson's have lots of bits of their gene which increase their risk. What this leads to is that the protein that lies at the heart of Parkinson's starts to become abnormal, the alpha-synuclein. This alpha-synuclein can then escape from one cell and infect another cell, so it can spread across the brain once it's started. That causes cells to misbehave, to become unhappy. That causes inflammation, which aggravates the problem with the cells. The cells then die, and then patients present with their clinical problems. Now, if that cascade, which is rather simplistic, is correct, there are a number of opportunities we have for intervening. So the first is we could try and go after the protein that's abnormal. So could we get rid of alpha-synuclein by stop it being produced or by reducing its production? Can we stop it spreading? And I'm going to talk about this in a minute. So can we use vaccines and immunizations to get rid of the protein spread? Can we stop the cells misbehaving, becoming dysfunctional and then dying by using drugs which are already in the clinic and which we rebadge to think that they may help around this process in Parkinson's, or gene therapies, which I'll talk about tomorrow? Can we stop inflammation, given that seems to be linked at many different levels? Can we replace the lost dopamine, forget the pathway, just replace the lost dopamine by putting dopamine back with a gene therapy, or replacing it by trying to grow it back with some fertilizer, or simply replacing it with a whole bunch of new cells? And I'll talk all about that tomorrow. Cell replacement, dopamine gene therapies, and fertilizers being given as proteins or genes to restore that network. And then there's a whole series of new symptomatic therapies that are coming along. So that's a sort of cascade which goes. Those are the nodes at which you could try and think of your intervention. And how much are we doing in this space at the moment? So this is a review that Kevin McFarlane does every year and publishes in the Journal of Parkinson's, and I strongly recommend you to look at it. So Kevin has Parkinson's. So this is all of the trials of last year. So just to orientate you, these are symptomatic therapies, things that make you better. These are disease modifying, which are ways of trying to slow down the disease process. Phase 1 trials are where you just take it into a small number of people to check it's feasible, it's safe, and it's well tolerated. You don't know whether it works, you're just trying to get a signal of whether you can take it to a bigger study. That's a phase 2 study, which tells you whether you actually got something that is really showing meaningful differences. And then you go to a phase 3 study, which is the study you do before you get the drug licensed for use in the clinic. So these are often can be done quite readily by biotech and academia. By here, this is quite hard because they're quite expensive trials. So using this information and knowing all of this, where have we got to with clinical trials? So I've explained a little bit about subtypes of disease. I've explained a little bit about the pathogenic pathway as people see it. I've given you some indication of the number of trials that are ongoing. So what about alpha-synuclein? Going right to the heart of the problem, this is the protein that lies at the core of Parkinson's. This is the protein that accumulates in the Lewy bodies, which characterizes this condition. Well, one approach that I'm not going to talk about, just above the box that's highlighted, is could you switch off alpha-synuclein? So could I give some therapy so it would stop you making alpha-synuclein? Now that sounds quite attractive, given that's the problem in Parkinson's. You also have to remember that 1% of your brain is alpha-synuclein. So if I got rid of all of your alpha-synuclein, you'd probably stop complaining about Parkinson's because you'd stop complaining about everything because your brain would not be working. So it's got to be a bit more selective than that. So one way to try and do this has been to try and knock it down a little bit with these things called antisense. I'm not going to talk about that. But there's quite a lot of interest in these things called beta agonists, Ventolin inhalers, salbutamol inhalers, because of some work that Clement Scherzer did a number of years ago. And that's actually one of the arms in one of the trials that's running here in Australia around drug repurposing. But what I'm going to talk about is this spread. So does alpha-synuclein begin in one cell and then spread to another? So this theory has been around for just under 20 years. So the idea here is that in Parkinson's disease, for whatever reason, your protein, this alpha-synuclein, changes from being one shape to another. So instead of being flat like that, it becomes in some way a different shape. When it becomes a different shape, it then meets your other normal alpha-synuclein, and when it sees it, it adopts this abnormal shape. So it sort of feeds off each other. So the abnormal one, which has come about perhaps by chance or through these genetic risks, then templates your own alpha-synuclein become abnormal. That cell then dies. It releases the abnormal form of alpha-synuclein, which then goes into another cell. It meets your normal alpha-synuclein, and so it carries on. So this has been described before in other diseases, most famously in these conditions called prion disease, Creutzfeldt-Jakob disease, in the UK, mad cow disease. So what is the evidence for this relates to some work that was done with transplants, which I'll mention tomorrow, but essentially this theory has a lot of evidence from in the lab. Now, if this is true, then there's probably not much I can do about the alpha-synuclein becoming abnormal in its shape, but if it escapes and then infects another cell, that's very much like a virus. Virus gets into one cell, kills that cell, out comes the virus, pops into the next cell. How do you get rid of viruses? Well, apart from giving antivirals, you can immunize people to stop them getting those infections. So that's the theory here. What people want to do is give you some vaccine to kill off the protein so it can't get from one cell to another. So these vaccination or immunization trials can work in two ways. One is you could give someone whatever this alpha-synuclein is that you think is abnormal. You inject it into your arm or leg or wherever. Your body sees that as an abnormal bug, if you like. It produces an antibody and it kills it off. And then it will go to the brain and kill off the form that's actually spreading and causing disease. That's called active immunization. Passive immunization is where you simply get antibodies which you think will kill off that form of alpha-synuclein and you infuse them into patients. It's the same principle. In both cases, you're trying to produce an antibody that will actually kill off the protein. So this whole theory has actually really caught farmers' attention. So over the last 15 years, these are all the trials that have taken place with it. So this is like a major industry for industry. So they have been trying to develop these immune therapies to help you rid yourself of this protein and thereby slow down the disease. To date, this hasn't really worked. So far, we have not seen any positive results. Now, there may be reasons for that. One is, of course, the theory is wrong, that this protein spread doesn't happen. It can happen in the lab, but doesn't happen in people. That's one possibility. The other possibility is that the antibody which you produce obviously goes swimming around in your blood, because that's where you've put it, but actually doesn't really get into the brain, because your brain is protected from the blood. And if it does get into the brain, it can't get to where it's needed, which is where the protein's spreading, or the protein spreading is so slow that it doesn't really have time to have an impact over the duration of the studies. And that last point might be true, because when in these original studies they were done, so here we have a study where people basically had this immune therapy. And at 1 year, there were no differences in those who'd had the immunization versus those who had just had a pretend immunization, placebo. Over time, those who'd had the immunization, so this is a score, these are all various scores, and the higher you are, the worse you are. This group here didn't have placebo. This is just a natural history study from the Michael J. Fox. And what you can see is as the years go by, the groups that did actually have the immune therapy seem not actually to progress. So whilst the 1 year time point showed no significant difference, the 4 year time point suggests that there may be something in this. So that raises questions as to whether we're actually doing trials too quickly. And I know people want trials done quickly and they want results quickly, but in a disease that progresses very slowly, longer times in smaller numbers of patients may be the answer. So whilst immunisation therapy has yet to prove to be effective, there is some evidence that it actually is working if we look over the long term. So that is an exciting area of development, immune therapies around alpha-synuclein. Another approach which relates to this is that there are rare families who have problems with alpha-synuclein who could be the way to try and prove this more definitively. But when I was talking about heterogeneity of Parkinson's, I was really talking about sporadic disease, which is the vast majority of people with Parkinson's. There are, however, rare genetic variants of Parkinson's. So there are people who inherit a gene which will mean they will get Parkinson's. Now, if I take my patients in Cambridge, so for every 100 patients I see in my clinic, perhaps one will have one of these. So these are incredibly rare cases in the general population. The value for our therapies and for understanding Parkinson's disease is that knowing that someone has a gene that definitely gives them Parkinson's implies that whatever that gene is doing, it's got to be relevant in some way for Parkinson's. It's obviously not causing it in most people, but perhaps it's contributing. From a therapeutic point of view, this has enabled people to try therapies in people who have specific genetic forms of Parkinson's. And this ability to genotype people, work out what genes they've got, has been transformed in the last 25 years. So the very first human genome study took 3 years and cost goodness knows how many gazillions of pounds. You can now do as a sort of genome, a genetic sequencing of someone in an afternoon, and it costs a few $100s or a few £100. So this is becoming more frequent, and I think one of the ways in which we'll be looking at Parkinson's in the future is actually not just describing what people look like, their phenotype, but actually looking at their genetics, because drug therapies may be better off targeting certain forms of Parkinson's, and I'll come back again to that. So here, just to sort of finish this bit of the talk off, these are the different types of genes which are associated with it. I've talked about alpha-synuclein. This I'll come back to. So this is a gene which codes for a thing called GCAs, or Gaucher's disease, which many of you may have heard of. There are a whole group of patients who have this rare condition with a LRRK2 mutation. There are now multiple trials targeting these aspects in these patients. And then there are young onset patients who have a defect in a gene called Parkin, who are also the subject of trials, including Parkin gene therapy. It's also fair to say that whilst most people don't have these genes, as I say, they probably have something to do with Parkinson's, so that if this works in these conditions, they may help everybody with Parkinson's, probably not to the same extent as people who have genetic forms, but nevertheless could still help. So I've explained that if you look at Parkinson's, there are different subtypes in the population. There are also genetic forms of it. I've also talked a little bit about how we can study it in the lab and using brain tissue and how that informs about pathways. And I've also taken you through the pathways to illustrate how they link together to go from someone who carries risk genes to developing the condition. One of the areas which has become particularly attractive over the last few years has been this drug repurposing. And this is where you take a drug which is already in clinical use for one reason and you rebadge it and try it in another condition. So an illustration of this would be simvastatin, a statin, been around forever. It's used for high cholesterol. We know how to use it because it's been used in millions of people across the planet. There's some evidence that simvastatin may affect inflammation in the brain. You then do a trial of simvastatin in people with Parkinson's on the grounds that inflammation is important. That trial proved to be negative, but the important point is it illustrates how you can do drug repurposing, because it can happen very quickly, because we know the drug, we know the cost, we know its side effects, we don't need to do anything more than just set up a trial and get going with it. So this sort of challenge, if you like, was taken on by Cure Parkinson's in the UK. And they set about this program 12 years ago, and I was fortunate enough to be involved with this. And this has grown into a major initiative with other initiatives being set up around the world. So this linked clinical trials, has brought together large numbers of groups, including charities, and most importantly, the patient voice. So the other big change that's happened in the world of drug trials over the last 10 to 15 years is that the patient voice lies at the heart of it. So every year for the International Linked Clinical Trials, we meet, we go through dossiers, we rank drugs, we have patients who also inform us about their views on the feasibility of doing this, as well as charity and other experts. And over the last few years, these are all of the trials which have been taken place. And that earlier wheel you saw, a lot of those trials have been funded through this approach. So I'm now going to take you through an illustration of how this works, some of the frustrations and some of the time it takes, which will then lead me on to how we might be able to do this a bit quicker. So the study I'm going to talk about is a study called exenatide. So exenatide is a GLP-1 agonist which was developed for diabetes. And there was evidence during the first part of this century that exenatide may have a positive effect on slowing down Parkinson's. So my good friend Tom Faltney set out to do a trial of this back in 2013, or it was published in 2013. Now, this was a study that didn't have a placebo arm. So in this study, what he did was he took a group of people with Parkinson's, and they either had this GLP-1 agonist exenatide injected, or they simply were followed. They didn't have a placebo, and the reason they didn't have a placebo is we didn't have enough money. So one of the problems with placebo is it's incredibly expensive. So this is injected. So to have a placebo would cost you somewhere in the region of £250,000 to £350,000 just to have a placebo. So we didn't have the money, so it was decided why not just look to see what happens. So it's very difficult to see this, but this is getting worse if you go up, and this is getting better. So in this study, what Tom did was he took people with Parkinson's, they were randomized to either have the treatment or just to be followed up in the same way. And over 12 months, those who had the injections did better. So you think, well, they could feel better because they want to feel better. The person looking at them wants them to feel better. Everyone wants them to be better, so they're better. Then what happened was that a year, they stopped the medication, and then they assessed them 2 months later. And all those who had been on the active treatment, i.e. had the injections, felt better for it. He then followed them up a year later, during which time they had not had the drug, and they were still better. So they had the medication for a year, seemed to make them better. 2 months after, they were still better. 12 months after that, they were still better. So this was encouraging enough for Tom to take it on to a bigger study, which then published in 2017. So now this was a proper double-blind placebo-controlled trial, by which I mean which is the gold standard of trials. So double-blind placebo-controlled trial means you come into the trial, you have a treatment, you don't know whether you've had the treatment, and I'm assessing you, and I don't know whether you've had the treatment. So we're both blinded. So that gets rid of any placebo effect in the patient, or takes it into account. It also gets rid of any investigator bias. And what you could see in this study was that those who were on exenatide clearly seemed to improve and then stabilise compared to those who had the placebo. So this implied that actually taking exenatide in a bigger study, in a more rigorous study, in terms of it being blinded, over a year produced a positive effect. And Tom then sought to explain how that was, and he thought it might be related to exenatide having some effect on inflammation. He then took this forward to a much bigger 196 patient study over 2 years. And what he found, and it was published earlier this year, was it made no difference. So 12 years, probably more like 15, there was no difference. So here, this is the group, 96 weeks. You cannot tell there's any difference between those who took placebo and those who took exenatide. So that's obviously very disappointing, and that took 15 years to get to that. It's not the end of the story with these GLP-1 agonists, because other people are still finding effects. So this is a study which came out last year showing that those who were on another type of this drug seem to be benefiting. So it's still unclear whether this still has mileage, but it's definitely been a very educational exercise in the prolonged nature of undertaking studies to produce what are disappointing results, but may not be, as I say, the end of that field. Another area that I just want to pick up on is something which I think will become relevant to a large number of people in this room. So this is a study called the ASPRO trial, which is being done in the UK, but there's an equivalent study being done here in Australia. So this relates to a gene called GBA. So GBA, if you inherit two abnormal genes, you get a very rare condition called Gaucher's, which is typically a childhood disease, big spleen, big liver. Now, Ellen Zadransky, many years ago, who ran a Gaucher's clinic, was interested to note that lots of people in families with people with Gaucher's seem to be getting Parkinson's. So she couldn't quite explain that, but subsequently it was shown that actually the gene of which you need two abnormal forms to get Gaucher's, one abnormal form greatly increased your risk of Parkinson's. And probably 10% of people with sporadic Parkinson's actually have this gene abnormality. So it's the commonest genetic abnormality in Parkinson's. 1 in 10 people have it. And it also has some clinical implications. So I said at the beginning, what turns somebody from a relatively benign form into a more malignant? This gene probably has something to do with it. People who inherit this abnormal gene tend to progress more quickly, and that is not only in the short term, but in the long term. So this implies that this gene is not only important in getting Parkinson's, but is also important in driving it, making it behave in a less favourable fashion. Now, it was discovered that there's a drug called Ambroxol, which is a cough mixture, which actually, in this study that was done by Tony Shapira in London, actually increases the activity of the enzyme which is coded for by that gene. So this abnormal gene reduces the level of this enzyme. That enzyme is thought to be important in you clearing away alpha-synuclein, which I mentioned at the beginning. So this is like the dustbin man is a bit lazy, a bit sloppy, not really doing his job. And that is what this gene is thought to code for. What Tony found was that in a very small number of people, 18 people, when they gave this drug Ambroxol, the enzyme level in the CSF, so in the fluid that circulates around your brain, goes up. So over a half year, you could increase the enzyme level. Now, if the enzyme goes up, then perhaps that means it's better at clearing away the protein, and therefore it may be able to slow down the progression of the disease. And that has now begun with a big trial in the UK. And as I say, here in Australia, there's which I'll come on to later, the Australian Parkinson Mission, which is around using drugs in Parkinson's, and that also includes Ambroxol. So this is a therapy which may become very pertinent to many people with Parkinson's and is now being actively pursued as a treatment. I would caution about going again Ambroxol. I don't know what it's like here in Australia, but in the UK, if you wanted to take the dose they're trying in this trial, I think you have to drink 5 bottles of the cough mixture every day to get the dose. So it's a very high dose, but they've now manufactured it in a way which makes it more convenient. So I've talked a little about going down this cascade. I've talked a little bit about going after alpha-synuclein, which is encouraging. I've talked a little bit about drug repurposing around stopping cell death, the disappointment with the GLP-1 agonist exenatide, but that's not the end of the story because there are other encouraging studies coming out, and the excitement around Ambroxol and trying to tackle this enzyme deficiency, which is particularly seen in this GBA form of Parkinson's. What about inflammation? Because this keeps popping up through this talk. So inflammation in Parkinson's has been around for a long time, and it used to be, the argument used to be that what you see in Parkinson's is inflammation in response to things dying. So when you cut your arm, you get inflammation around where you've cut your arm. Inflammation didn't cause the cut, it's simply there to try and deal with the injury. So all you're seeing in Parkinson's, so the story went, was that inflammation was simply a consequence of the brain being unwell and had nothing to do with the disease. Now, I've never really believed that, and actually we then went on to show that there were genetic reasons why we thought inflammation might be central to Parkinson's. So this HLA here, this gene is the gene which is associated with things like multiple sclerosis, rheumatoid arthritis, psoriasis, diseases where you have an autoimmune response. So it's where your immune system misbehaves and you start to attack yourself. We found there was an association between Parkinson's and this gene, which implied that the immune system probably had a role to play, and that was then subsequently confirmed in a much bigger study. Caroline Williams-Gray, who runs her own group next door to mine in Cambridge, also found that when we took people with newly diagnosed Parkinson's, took blood from them and then followed them over 3 years, people who had a lot of inflammation in their blood, using simple measures that we had, seemed to progress more quickly. They ended up falling quicker and developing more thinking problems. It's also been shown at the population level that if you take drugs to suppress your immune system for whatever reason, rheumatoid arthritis, inflammatory bowel disease, so if you're on those heavy-duty immunosuppressive drugs, your risk of Parkinson's almost halves. And that's also been shown by Caroline in her study using GP records. So if you take immunosuppressive drugs, it may be slowing down, maybe reducing your risk because it's having a primary effect on the immune system. So there's quite a lot of evidence, both genetic and epidemiological, that the immune system is involved. There's lots of preclinical studies in the lab. The problem is that animals do not have our immune system, so the only way you can really prove this is to do a clinical trial. So Caroline has undertaken a trial with a drug called azathioprine, which is a very old drug which suppresses your immune system in a rather non-selective way. This was to show whether it actually could be done safely and whether it had any effect on clinical course. This trial has just finished, so I don't have the final results, but essentially Caroline took 60 patients. They were randomized to either have azathioprine or a placebo, so it was a double-blind controlled trial like the other ones. She then found that this drug did what it said it would do, so it suppressed the immune system both in the blood and in the CSF, and whether it makes a difference on the patient has yet to be fully reported, but there is some evidence that this drug does seem to be having an effect on the progression of Parkinson's. So this is the first trial where a drug specifically given to suppress inflammation may have had some positive effect, and on the back of that, Caroline has just started a second study looking at another aspect of inflammation with this drug. So targeting inflammation in Parkinson's is clearly becoming a major issue and a major area of interest. So the final bit I just want to touch upon is we must be able to do better than this. So exenatide, the idea was touted in 2009. The negative result was published in 2025. That is 16 years to get to a result. So now people are now thinking we've got to be better at doing this. So one of the problems with clinical trials is if I do a clinical trial, I have the idea, I have to get the money, I set it all up, I run the trial, collect the data, then I finish the trial, and then I analyse it. And then I have to start all over again. So the analogy I always have, in the UK is if, England were playing Germany at football, we build Wembley Stadium, we have a game of football, we then think, well, that's it, we take down Wembley Stadium, and then 6 months later they say, well, we want to play Spain. You think, right, we'll rebuild the stadium and we'll have another game of football. And that seems like an incredibly inefficient way to run things. So what Tom Fulton and Camille Carroll in the UK have done is they've set up this new idea, which are these multi-arm, multi-stage trials of which the patients have been absolutely at the centre of developing these trials. So this is the typical trial that I've already talked about, a double-blind placebo-controlled trial. You recruit some patients, they get randomised to treatment or placebo, the trial ends, you report the results, and so you move on and you do it again. What this new approach is that you take a whole group of patients and you randomize to have various treatments. You have one placebo arm, and then you do a sort of interim analysis, and if one of them is not producing any useful data to suggest it's working, you abandon it, and the patients get randomized into other treatment arms, and you keep adding treatments as you go along. So in the UK, this has been done for prostate cancer with a thing called the Stampede study. That trial began in 2007, is still going today, and it's made major changes to how we treat prostate cancer. So this, as I say, has been developed by having all the stakeholders involved with this, planning it over the last 3 years, and we're about to start this trial this summer. These are the first 2 drugs we're using. They're both drugs which target blood pressure, but we think actually will target what goes wrong in Parkinson's. A third treatment will come along, and so we will keep adding treatments as time goes on. Linked to this has not only been this capacity to move things forward more quickly with less placebo arms, more drugs being tried in a sort of simultaneous fashion, but there's also been this question as to how can we better measure whether our therapies have had any good. And people can polarize into 2 areas. One is you can go looking for objective measures, such as these apps, which I think we'll hear more about later on today. The other area which I've been more heavily involved with is actually trying to get the patients to tell us what they would like as their outcome. So patient-related outcomes are becoming much more important, and the regulatory agencies are very much looking to that. So this trial, which has been done in the UK, is not the only one. These are other trials. And in Australia, the Australian Parkinson Mission has 2 ongoing studies in this. The APM1 looks at a Ventolin-like drug, salbutamol, a calcium antagonist, a blood pressure tablet, and I can't quite remember the third one that they're looking at. Their new trial, which has just begun, is looking at ambroxol. It's looking at a drug called doxycycline, which suppresses inflammation, and then it's looking at both drugs together. So this is the way forward in terms of how we're thinking about trials, is trying to use more agents more quickly to move it forward. So to finish, we've clearly gaining a better understanding of Parkinson's, and with this we can understand subtypes, and we can start to understand what might underlie that, which means we will target therapies to specific groups of patients. That may involve specific genetic forms of it, but for most people in this room, we will be going after particular subtypes of disease around possibly what people look like and their genetic basis. We've had huge progress in the last 15 years in terms of the trials that are coming into clinic, but we clearly need to do better at trying to deliver them more quickly to make a difference for people with Parkinson's. And one area I haven't talked about, which I do think is the future, is this ability to use multiple drugs to target multiple pathways rather than go after one thing. In my lifetime, the most successful therapy, I think, has been in HIV. When I qualified many years ago, if you had HIV, you'd be dead within a year. Now you're essentially cured by use of combination therapies. The same is true for cardiovascular disease, heart attacks and strokes, and for TB and such like. So I think we're at the cusp of actually really moving this forward in a new way of looking at platform trials, multiple different drugs, looking at different pathways in groups of patients that we can better define. And then there's a whole group of very exciting new therapies which are also coming to clinic or in clinic around cells and genes, and I'm going to talk about that tomorrow. And with that, I'll finish, and I'm 3 minutes over.
Thank you so much, Roger.